Well, for some weeks now, we've had some tough readings. Matthew's parables, the tenants of the vineyard who kill the servants and the son, the wedding guests who don't come to the wedding and their city is destroyed, the bridesmaids who get shut out of the wedding, and then last week the parable of the talents, where that last unfortunate servant is cast into outer darkness. With all of these parables, we've been understanding that first of all, they're told in the week before Jesus' crucifixion, and so therefore the temperature is rising, the tension is rising, and the stories seem to get tougher and tougher. But we've also understood that all of the parables are about grace. The oil in the bridesmaid's lamp, the invitation to the wedding, the talents offered, they're all grace, freely offered from God, which we can refuse or reject, or we can accept as well. And the rejection of God's grace, that will feel like being cast into outer darkness. Kate said last week that we have to act on the grace given, to trade with it, like the slaves in the parable of the talents. She said, trading with what we have and who we are to enable grace, spirit, love, faith, and trust to abound. We don't need a lot of it to be abundant, but we do need an orientation and an intention to utilize what we have to grow that which benefits the life of the world. So that's all good. We've got that message now. God's grace is freely given, and we can choose to respond or not. And responding with a yes is much better than a no. But then we come to today's reading, which follows on from all of those others, and all of a sudden it seems not to be about grace at all. It's about good works, helping those in need. Now, in the 1st and 2nd century of the church, there was quite a debate about how people might get close to God. Some said it was all about works, like the writer of the letter of James, who said, faith without works is dead. Looking after those in need was an absolutely essential central part of the Christian life. Then others, like Paul, said, no, it's all about grace. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of your own doing, it's the gift of God, not the result of works, so that none of you might think you can start boasting about what you're doing. So it's as if Matthew has told all of the grace parables, and then at the last minute he decides he needs to throw in some good works reminders as well, just to make sure we're kind of not let off the hook about doing good works. But this is actually not a parable. It's not a story that Jesus tells. It's more of an apocalyptic vision of the end times. And Matthew and his community were expecting Jesus to return in their lifetime and to literally see the end of times. And so Matthew says, when that day comes, there will be those who will enter the kingdom, those who have fed the hungry, welcomed the stranger, taken care of the sick, and visited the prisoners. And those who do not, well, they are for the hot place. So what happened to grace? Well, as I was thinking about this question and wrestling with this week, I was remembering my sabbatical early in the year when I spent time at the Church of the Epiphany in downtown Washington, D.C. Sundays at Epiphany Church start at 6:30 a.m. in the morning. The doors open and the welcomers are there ready with a warm smile and a label for your name and a number, which you'll need later on for the breakfast queue. Well-organised teams of volunteers then set up for what is called the welcome table. Part 1 is groups from 7 a.m. till 8 a.m. There is Bible study, there is an art group, there are 12-step groups like Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous, there is choir practice. Everyone is invited to take part in the discussions. Everyone is listened to with respect and openness. Some people make sense in what they're saying, others not so much, but it doesn't matter, the respect is the same. Part 2 of the welcome table is the 8 o'clock Eucharist, and it's led by the Epiphany clergy, supported by a gospel-style choir made up of mostly people who are homeless. And those who read and lead the psalms and the prayers in the service are likely to have slept the night on the street or in a shelter. They all do it incredibly well. They've all practiced in that 7 a.m. slot. They know the ritual and the responses. And then part 3 of the welcome table is breakfast. Scrambled eggs, bacon and grits. I think the chef must be from the south in the United States. Fruit juice, coffee, fruit, orange juice. 150 or so people are fed each Sunday. And so the names and numbers are called up in groups of 40 or so, and people move through to breakfast, seated at tables with flowers in the centre, proper plates and cutlery, and coffee is poured by the volunteers. Everyone waits patiently for their turn to be called, sitting quietly in the church. My number was 119, so I waited quite a while and then moved through, was greeted warmly, chatting with others as we lined up to be served. I was shown to a table where others were eating. We chatted about the food and the weather, as you might do with any strangers at a table. I noticed that most of the guests were African American and most of them were men. Most of the volunteers were white, a mix of men and women. Then people moved off and the church was set up again for the 11 a.m. congregation, which is a style very much like ours. Some of the homeless folk stayed. The liturgy this time was led by a more traditional choir. There weren't as many people, though, as at the 8 o'clock service. The 8 o'clock service was packed. The 11 a.m. was nicely full. And then during the week at Epiphany on Tuesdays, there's another group of volunteers who take church out into the park along with lunch, and they have church outside in all weathers along with lunch on a Tuesday. And I asked the priest that I met with about their work. I said, do you do political advocacy or work with agencies with these people in order to try and get them housed? And the priest, Reverend Katrina Lang, looked at me kind of a bit puzzled and said, every person who comes here has a caseworker. There are a plethora of agencies working with them. That's not what we do. She said, our ministry is simply about being with people, nothing more. Our call is simply to be with, to listen, to respect, to provide a spiritual home where people are welcome, truly welcome, not treated with suspicion or hostility. A place where people have a name and a place where people are seen. A place where people are seen. I was deeply moved by my visit to Epiphany that week, and in reflecting on it afterwards, I decided it was because I was witnessing that very thing that she described, people being seen. The way that it operated all morning, that was absolutely evident. It was quite different. People with many challenges and issues, homelessness, addictions, mental health issues, we know the story. But each one was seen and felt seen and known, named, listened to, and cared for. So in Jesus' description of the end times, the righteous who are about to be blessed with life in the kingdom are told it is not because they helped the poor and the widows, but because they had helped Jesus himself. He says, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. And they say, what are you talking about? When was it that we saw you hungry? When was it that we saw you a stranger? We didn't do that. How can that be? And he answers, just as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. If you saw the need of a stranger, you saw them and helped them, not anonymously, but face to face, one person created in the image of God to another. So maybe this passage is about grace after all, because to be able to look at another person and truly see them as a beloved child of God takes grace. Left to our own devices, we aren't actually very good at loving our neighbour, but drawing on God's strength and grace, we might just be able to manage it. So this teaching of Jesus today calls us to look at each other with the eyes of faith, to see each other as one created in the image of God. Remember that challenge Jesus gave to the Pharisees a few weeks ago: give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The image of God is imprinted within each one of us, and so when we pay attention to each other, when we see each other, and listen and respect and honour each other, it is then that we meet Christ. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, prays that with the eyes of your hearts enlightened, you may know what is the hope to which you are called, what are the riches of the glorious inheritance, like the talents, among the saints, and how all things are to be found with Christ. So we close out our church year today with this assurance that Christ is within each of us and in our world, and with the challenge to be sure that we take notice, to be sure that we open our hearts to God's grace and open our eyes to see each other truly as we are, created in God's image. And then next week, we'll begin again with the first Sunday of Advent, and it will be Mark, not Matthew this time, who will be telling us to watch and keep awake and be alert for the coming of the Son of Man.